I was carrying my hand quilting with me in a garment bag and doing that on layovers in other cities. And I got to Buffalo, New York, and ran out of thread. And the lady at the front desk told me there was a shop a block away that might have thread. And it was a quilt shop. And at that point, I had never actually been in a quilt shop.
It's 1984-85, and Caryl Bryer Fallert-Gentry is working as a flight attendant for United Airlines.
And at the front desk of this shop, there was a calendar that featured quilts that were all made as artworks to hang on the wall, which was a concept I hadn't been exposed to up to that point.
At the time, sewing and quilting were just hobbies for Caryl.
The owner of the shop invited me to a lecture that evening at the Amherst Museum, which was just down the street from my hotel.
The lecturer is Jean Ray Laurie, a fine artist who started exhibiting quilt works in 1958.
And this was like the moment of epiphany in my life when I discovered that this whole world of quilting was available and something that one could do, and it seemed very appealing.
Today, a 50-year retrospective of Carol's work is hanging at the National Quilt Museum in Paducah.
Red Poppies was the first quilt I designed after I discovered that you could make quilts as art. But just in case nobody wanted to hang it on the wall, I made it bed size. But it ended up in the National Quilt Museum, so not bad.
As we approach AQS Quilt Week in Paducah, we're taking a look at quilting as a way to capture history, both public and personal, and the role of quilting as a tool for community building and social change.
These are the things that Black women have been dealing with throughout generations. This is more on an elevated, platform to say, this is what I'm passionate about, this is what I feel, and this is what I want people to be educated about.
I'm Bryce Patterson. You're listening to the Crossroads Suncast. Stacey Watson is a historian, curator, and the former director of equitable partnerships at the National Quilt Museum. To get to the role of quilts in today's culture, she starts in the past.
Thinking about quilting as a functional piece initially, thinking about the basic necessity of what quilting was for historically, whether that was to prepare you for colder climates, whether it was, hanging it over your door, protect you from the sun or provide you with shade, as opposed to, warmth. And, the scraps of quilting were very useful, for insulated layers.
Quilting, and the work of seamstresses in general, is deeply tied to the history of slavery in the United States. Watson says that work was forced labor, but also a space for resistance.
When you have the moments where women could get together, where they didn't have their, enslavers or overseers or people overlooking what they were doing. And this is the time to come together as a community and not feel that you have to be in this confined space of these eyes over you. These are the times where we can talk about escape.
It was also a time to build culture.
These are the times where we can talk about recipes, and then those things are passed down for multiple generations.
Sometimes, quilting became a tool for women to break out of that system.
Elizabeth Keckley was formerly enslaved, and she used her skills to buy her freedom, as well as pay for her son to go to college.
Born into slavery in Virginia in 1817, Keckley started selling her work as a seamstress when the family she was enslaved to hit hard times financially. Eventually, she paid $1,200 to emancipate herself and her son. From there, she moved to Washington, D.C. in 1860.
She ends up working in the White House and using those same skills to help create dresses. She ended up creating a quilt that basically shows the movement of freedom and liberation.
Through her work as the White House seamstress, she developed a relationship with First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln. Keckley was working at the White House in 1862 when the Lincoln's 11-year-old son, Willie, died of typhoid fever. She later described the scene, writing, quote, I assisted in washing him and dressing him, and then laid him on the bed. When Mr. Lincoln came in, I never saw a man so bowed down with grief. Her relationship with Mary Todd Lincoln continued after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in 1865. That relationship came to an end after Keckley published her memoirs, which included an unusually candid look at life with the Lincolns.
It's the irony of enslavement, and freedom and liberation, and then using these skills to then, continue to provide a sense of expression in a way that creates a legacy for Miss Elizabeth Keckley. And it shows how she made a way out of no way. So you get to see that in a lot of these stories of enslaved people from this time period.
I started researching women's suffrage in the 18 and 1900s, and came across a photograph that's in the Library of Congress or one of the Smithsonian museums, and it it was a picture of officers of the National Women's Party standing in front of their headquarters in Washington, D.C., holding up a banner with a saying by Susan B. Anthony. And it looked like it had been printed on a wrinkly old bed sheet, and but it looked like a bunch of quilters holding up something at show and tell.
That's Caryl describing the inspiration behind her quilt, First Ladies. The quote on the banner: "No self-respecting woman should wish or work for the success of a party that ignores her sex." Carol's version takes that historical image and reimagines it in vibrant color, bringing in the names and images of important women throughout American history. The list grew and grew as she worked.
I'm going, well, Frances Perkins was the first women cabinet member, la da da. And I started doing more research and came up with 162 names. And then I thought, well, I could put the names on the back of the quilt, but most places where the quilt is hung, they're not going to see the back. So how about if I put it underneath and make it a separate quilt, which is how that ended up. So you can actually lift the flap and see a list of names in alphabetical order and what they actually did.
Putting together a 50-year retrospective of her work has also driven Caryl to reflect on a different kind of history.
I have made more than 600 quilts in 50 years, and I own about 100 of them. So most of my quilts have been sold. And so the older quilts that I still owned, some of which were just not in my art style, they were kind of pre-art quilt or shortly thereafter. And and some of them were just very personal quilts that are not for sale because they're about family and my life. And so those are the ones that are in the show.
Those quilts range from reflections on the death of a loved one to family stories.
My father was a watchmaker for the Elgin Watch Company, and when he died at the age of 103, I inherited his watch parts cabinet, and with all of his organized, sparkly little parts. And so I took a lot of photographs of the drawers and made a whole quilt just about watches.
Stacey Watson and Caryl Bryer Fallert-Gentry are both educators, but they approach that role in different ways as artist and historian.
My purpose is to highlight the voices that are often unheard. To provide a sense of voice to the voiceless. And when I say voiceless, I'm also including those who are deceased, people who never got a chance to tell their story for whatever reason, and then their story is not included in the textbook.
Here's how Caryl thinks of her own teaching.
My favorite thing to teach was design classes where I could help people make original designs and then ask them what their goals were and help them reach their own goals. I wasn't teaching people how to make exactly the same thing I made. I always thought I was successful if all my students' work looked different than mine.
In 1989, Caryl won Best in Show at Paducah's AQS Quilt Week for a machine quilted piece, marking the first time a quilt like that had been recognized in that way. It was a controversial decision at the time, but now it's a standard method of quilting. She'll be talking about that and her career as a whole at Paducah Quilt Week events. Her 50-year retrospective will remain on display at the National Quilt Museum through October 7th.